what attracted these giants of the literary world to visit a small castle in Ayrshire in southwest Scotland? For Robert Burns, it was a playground. For John Keats, the last of the great English romantic poets, it was a fine ruin. For Robert Louis Stevenson, no, I'm afraid, not interested. In fact, he called it dilapidated. I'm going to tell you about Baltersan Castle, a stately fine house with a fantastic history and significant architectural features. Hello, I'm James Brown, an independent local historian living in South Ayrshire. This place that attracted so many famous people is a wonderful story, and I'm going to tell you it now. Baltersan, now please note the pronunciation. Baltersan rhymes with person. Easy to remember. It's a Gaelic name, meaning cross-steading, a farm at a crossing place. Baltersan was built in 1584 by John Kennedy of Pennyglen and his first wife, Margaret Cathcart. Margaret was from a very well-known and leading family in Ayrshire, the Cathcarts of Carleton, albeit they largely lived at the Tower House of Kirlochan near Girvan. Now, Kennedy was the inheritor of a large sum of money. I have a copy of his father's will, so we know how much his father left and how much property he had. His father, David Kennedy of Pennyglen, was an attorney for the Kennedy Earls of Castles, most famously for Gilbert, the fourth Earl of Castles, a notorious figure who called himself the King of Carrick. Like so many people who are full of self-aggrandizement, he did come to an unfortunate end when he fell from his horse and died, but that's another story. Baltersan was described in the late 16th century as being a stately fine house by, I believe, Timothy Pont, Scotland's greatest cartographer and chorographer. Timothy Pont was the son of an Edinburgh minister of the Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church. And he astonishingly travelled Scotland, the length and breadth of Scotland, for about 13 years, mapping the whole country. His maps were never produced during his lifetime, but fortunately for us, in 1654, Johannes Blau of Amsterdam, the world's leading map producers, created a new Atlas Novus, an atlas of the world. Scotland had over 30 pages in that atlas, and with 20,000 place names, was the best mapped country in the world. Now, Baltersan appears in it, very fortunate, and albeit shown as icons rather than a proper representation of the building, but we know it was a significant building, the particular icon. There was a hierarchy. The more important the castle, the bigger the adornments and the turrets and the flags and so on. But Baltersan was very well represented. So as I say, 1584, this place, it wasn't built in a year, of course, because with all buildings you could only work during the portion of the year between March and September when there's no frost, because everything's been used with lime mortar and so on, and lime doesn't cure if there's frost. So it probably took about 3 years. So I believe that it's believed that it was 1590 or thereabouts he was in this area of southwest Scotland called Carrick, and produced 2 maps of Carrick, North Carrick and South Carrick. And as I said, he would see Baltersan in its finished state. It would be a brand new house, and he called it stately fine house. So in many ways, although it was simply Baltersan, it was in many ways a castle. Although a pedant like me would argue it's a dower house, not a castle. But nevertheless, What made him say a fine, stately house? I think through a close study of the architecture, we will find that there are a lot of subtleties in Baltersan that if we saw it as it was freshly built, we would immediately fall in love with it and say, oh yes, that is a very fine house. Now, Kennedy originally called Kennedy of Baltersan, sorry, my apologies, Kennedy of Pennyglen rather, his father's home, near the coast, near Dunure. Now, Kennedy, as I say, was actually an illegitimate child of David Kennedy of Pennyglen. It's a rather interesting thing because he's illegitimate, so how could he inherit? Well, by giving a donation to King James VI, David Kennedy would have succeeded, and I know he did succeed, it's in charter evidence, of having his son legitimised. So a post-marriage legitimisation, because in fact his mother wasn't his father's wife. His mother was, very soon after John's birth, married the Earl of Castles, the famous Gilbert Earl of Castles. That made him being John Kennedy, who becomes John Kennedy of Baltersan, made him a half-brother to the Earl of Castles, the notorious Gilbert, King of Carrick. That elevated him to positions of favour and so on at the royal court. But however, being illegitimate, he wouldn't be quite in the inner circle, but nevertheless, he's there. Where did the money come from for this beautiful house? It would be equivalent to getting Sir Richard Rogers, Lord Rogers, I think, very famous English architect, very famous. It'd be equivalent to getting him to say, could you design me a 4-bedroom house, please? Such is the quality of the architecture of this building. But anyway, Kennedy, 1584, dies 1610 at his other tower house called Greenan Castle, the Heads of Ayr, right on the coast. In fact, it couldn't be any closer to the coast or it would fall down onto the beach. Greenan Castle is a very famous tower house right at the edge of the rocks above the beach at the Bay of Ayr. Now, Kennedy died there in 1610, as I say. His widow, Florence Nickdowell, using the Gaelic form of her name, Florence, his second wife, went on to marry Alan Cathcart, the Cathcarts of Colochan family. Now, John, devil that he was, removed the bells of Crossraguel Abbey, but I'll save that story for another day. Let's focus on the Kennedys themselves. John's son, also called John, as tradition in Scotland, the first son is named for the father, and John became a knight, but not in the way we think of as a knight in armour and Sir Lancelot, etc. It was actually an ecclesiastical title. Sir John Kennedy, he became the commendator of Soulseat Abbey down in Galloway. Now, Soulseat, sadly, there's practically nothing left, a few stones, and it must have been an important abbey in its day, but this is post-Reformation. There should be no more abbeys. There's certainly no more abbots. The Presbyterian, or the Church of Scotland as we know it today, replaced the Roman Catholic Church in the Reformation in 1560 in Scotland. And in the case of Soulseat and the other abbeys like Crossraguel beside Baltersan, the abbots were replaced with essentially a general manager. The title was commendator. And Kennedy's son was the commendator. Kennedy himself actually was drawing a pension from the profits, we call it the profits, the revenues of Soulseat Abbey of about £200 per year. This is Scots pounds, by the way, back then, which the exchange rate was you needed about 12 Scots pounds to 1 English pound, we now call pound sterling. So Kennedy is succeeded by his son, who not long after succeeding to Baltersan Castle sells it on to another branch of the Kennedys, quite a notorious Kennedy actually, which again is a story for another day. This was a real nasty Kennedy who was sold on to. And that younger Kennedy then settles near Maybole and also has Greenan. But he also became a servant to King James VI. So they're well in. Now at Greenan Castle, on the lintel above the entrance door, there are two sets of initials, JK for John Kennedy of Baltersan, the father, the older one, 1603, and FND, Florence Nick Dowell, Nick being the equivalent, the female equivalent of Mac, Nick being daughter of, Nain being the Gaelic word for daughter. So we know it's engraved in stone that Florence used the Gaelic form of her name. She would be a Gaelic speaker, as the MacDowells were in Galloway and so on. And so we know that John Kennedy would have understood Gaelic, and that this is another aspect of this very rich history of this area of Carrick. But back to the Kennedys themselves. So it stays in Kennedy hands. Different branches of the family, and following on from John's death, it moves to another, I think it's Alexander Kennedy, and one of his sons inherits Baltersan, Thomas Kennedy, and Thomas Kennedy, I believe, is a major, and I think he was a major in the Covenanting army, because just nearby, across, about 500 metres, half a mile away or something from Baltersan Castle, there was a thorn tree on the lands of Baltersan Mains farm, where Alexander Peden, very famous Covenanter, had preached at open-air conventicles, as it was called. Anyway, so Sir Thomas passes on. It's inherited by somebody down at Ardstinger Castle, a Crawford, who is married to Sir Thomas's daughter, one of his daughters. And that time passes again, and along comes the last of the line, yet another John Kennedy, who in his testament, his last will and testament, which is actually testament dative, it was drawn up after his death. Now, John Kennedy is described as having died abroad at London, which for a Scot always sounds good fun to consider London abroad. And anyway, he died at a very young age, probably about 25, I think, in 1721. And he was the last of the Kennedys to live there. The next man who comes along is actually Captain Hugh Arbuthnot. Now, I think he wasn't a Royal Navy captain, although he was based at Deptford, which was a very famous Royal Navy base in London. I can't find his records in Royal Navy records, so perhaps he was captain of a merchant ship. And he inherited Baltersan. He was a cousin, actually, of Kennedy. This is an era, bear in mind, we're talking about 1721, where many Scots had followed King James VI when he became James I of England in that Greenan date of 1603, remember? I think this was John Kennedy of Baltersan putting up 1603 to celebrate King James becoming King of England. Now, in London already were many Scots, including Kennedys. I came across two who were saddlers, made leatherwork and saddle work for horses. And they were from Ayr, and they were settled in London. They're very famous gardener. This is a period where all the big houses, don't say all the big houses, that's wrong. Many of those very big houses in England, especially in London, the head gardener was a Scotsman, and they were sought after. The English were poaching Scotland for good gardeners. They had wonderful skills, and it's well on record that the landed gentry in England are saying, "Oh, have you got a Scottish gardener? We've got one, they're great," for some reason. And there was a very famous one, actually, a Kennedy gardener in London, but again, we're sidetracking here. So back to Baltersan. It's now in the hands of Hugh Arbuthnot and his wife, and they have some legal tussles with the not the Marquis of, oh yeah, it would be Marquis of Ailsa at this time, yes, I think it was, and if not, it's the Earl of Castles, the head of the Kennedy clan, and there's a bit of a legal argument where the Kennedy person is saying, the last Kennedy, his father, he gave me a document saying that I will inherit Baltersan. And this went to the highest court in the land, to the Court of Session, the highest civil court in Scottish law. And Arbuthnot won, actually. So he's very lucky that the Kennedys didn't manage to claw back Baltersan. But it would seem this part of the story has yet to be properly researched. I know the research papers exist, but time is needed to study them. But it looks like about 1745 or thereabout, based on a coin that I actually found in Baltersan. And even that, the rummaging under the ground that I did is a story for another day. But that, about 1745, and we're now into the Jacobite era, and 1746 was the Battle of Culloden. Most of the people round about Maybole and so on by this time were anti-Jacobite. Not all of them. The local minister in Maybole was a Jacobite, the Reverend Fairweather. But nevertheless, we'll say that Arbuthnot and his wife, they pass on, and the building falls into disrepair. It becomes owned by the Fergusons of Kilcurran. And but this time, fashions have changed. Whereas a tower house is, as the name tells you, it is a tall tower. It's a very tedious thing to climb up wheel stairs, turnpike stairs. Never call them spiral stairs. Spirals go to a point. It's a turnpike. So in these rounded staircases, it's a very tedious thing to go up and down. So someone had the bright idea to say, lie the building on its side. You only need to go up one story. But the fashion changes and country houses become low and wide. So Baltersan gets abandoned. It is stripped, I'm sure, by the Fergusons of Kilcurran. Removed the slates from the roof. I've got some evidence of it. Removed the ironwork from the windows and so on, which we'll come on to when I tell you about the architecture. And so it just simply falls into disrepair and is abandoned. So to this very day, Baltersan has lain as a ruin.